open data. This is Mission Control. You are go for lunch.
Spend some time away from your office bay to the Good Cafe. Open data, go open data. Open data, go open data. We meet up virtually. Our beverages are free for open data coffee. Open data, go open data. Open data, go open data. Well, welcome to the Good Cafe. It's Tuesday, November the 2nd, 2021, and welcome to the Good Cafe. This is our season finale, and on today's menu, we're going to be talking about included out and excluded in. What's that, you might say? Well, we're going to talk about inclusion and equity and diversity and awareness about all three things. And of course, through the lens of open data. And our guests today, three fine folks, experts in the field, really, of these issues. My Phan, Megan Linton, and Cybele Sack are going to be with us today. And before we move into the official introductions, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. And I want to acknowledge that the land I'm broadcasting from is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Ushnish, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and acknowledge all of the Indigenous populations in the province of Ontario and beyond. Okay, at this point, let's introduce our folks. And I'm going to go to our gallery view, and hopefully everybody can see all four of us now. So, folks, you can unmute at this point as we do the introductions. I'd like to introduce my Phan, who is working with us in Go Open Data as well. She's actually involving herself as the lead in inclusion and diversity and access. So she's a valued member of our team, and she's a passionate advocate for data equity, social justice, equity, and human rights. And she has over 20 years' experience teaching, researching, developing, and leading initiatives to address systemic barriers and promote inclusive practices and policies in public sector organizations that are evidence-based and community-centered. Her interests are all things data-related, including questioning and exploring our practices of collecting, governing, using, and sharing data that honor our values, promote collective and individual empowerment, and support more sustainable and humane ways of being. So welcome, Mai. And next we have Megan Linton. And Megan is a disability policy researcher, writer, and advocate. Her research and advocacy focuses on the pervasive use of institutions for disabled children and adults across Ontario and the need for deinstitutionalization. She's passionate about data gaps, chocolate chip cookies, and abolition. She recently graduated with a master's in public policy and administration from Carleton University, where she works as a teaching assistant and research assistant on projects related to disability, political economy, and public policy. So welcome, Megan. And finally, we have Cybele Sack, who's a consultant with a focus on social innovation, inclusive design, and digital accessibility. She's an award-winning startup coach, facilitator, researcher, writer, and editor. She thinks deeply about the social impacts of technology. She's an invited expert on accessibility with the W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative. And she's led accessibility workshops for Ryerson University, OCAD, and is working with Civic Tech Toronto to plan an accessible hackathon. Cybele is a domain agnostic, a proficient generalist, coaching clients in the fields as varied as cryptocurrency and opera. And she's especially informed about environmental science, journalism, patient safety, accessibility, AI ethics, and entrepreneurship. And that's Cybele. So welcome, all three of you. So we're going to talk about a number of things, I think, under our banners here of accessibility, diversity, and equity. And one of the first things is the idea of open data and open data neutrality or non-biased data, I guess. And one of the reasons I wanted to get into this early is that we just recently had a data governance forum. And on that forum, our guests were talking about data not being neutral, in fact, being biased. And all of the panel agreed with that. And it was an interesting exchange. So I've got one segment here. This is Enica Oliveira, who is with the Standards Council of Canada. And this was just her quick answer around the idea of data not being neutral. So just play that clip for us, and we'll come back and talk a bit about it.
I think it's a really complicated question because data is not neutral just because we're human beings and human beings are consuming the data. So we come with our own biases and prejudices. And I mean, that's why machine learning can be so scary. I think I have a couple of answers when it comes to sharing of data. I think that there are also huge cultural sensitivities around that. And if you look at data of First Nations and Métis and Inuit, that's not the government's right to share their data, even though that happens all the time. And they don't actually have access to their own data. So it's a complicated question.
All right, so there we go. The idea then of open data not being, let's say, neutral or unbiased bothers me in one sense because I've been an open data advocate for a long, long time, including working with the City of Toronto about it. You know, we went on our merry way trying to talk about open data being good to encourage trust in government. And it's kind of like neutral ground. We've even used those words before. Using your data can help plan decision making, and lots of people looking at the data can help inform things, and it's all positive and good. And then we come to this data governance forum and our expert panelists are talking about, no, it's not really true. There's lots of problems with data. So that being said, as a premise for initial discussion, does anyone want to weigh in about what that means to them, how we can try and ensure that it doesn't become biased? I mean, what are we really talking about here? If in fact open data isn't neutral, I think we have a real problem as open data advocates. Mai, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I was about to say I can jump in, and it's a tough one because I mean, the comment that we heard from the speaker that you shared with us, you know, speaks about the issues of who's consuming the data, who's using it, but bias starts from the very beginning. How is data being collected? Who's included in the data? And also who gets to define the concepts and the categories used. And, you know, it starts from even before we collect the data, where exclusions can happen, misrepresentations can happen, values are built in, assumptions are built in to those constructs that determine what data is meaningful even, right? And so how do we address that? Well, we have to address it right from the beginning, I suppose, is a good place to start. And I mean, you know, obviously that's impractical. We have data sets out there currently that's being used. We have concepts and constructs and categories that are, you know, now kind of taken for granted. And so having to unpack and understand exactly, you know, what those are and reveal the hidden underlying assumptions that they reflect is a good start. And being really transparent about that. And so, you know, being critical about our data and our data systems and our data practices as we currently have in place. And then thinking, you know, more expansively about how we can change those things so that, you know, future data or the data we are currently developing will be a bit better on those regards and include more people and address some of those hidden assumptions that are so harmful. So I'll stop there, and I see Cybele nodding her head.
Yeah, I think assumptions are made, right? And I wonder if Megan and Cybele, if you've got some thoughts about that. Is it too presumptuous to think that no data can be neutral? For example, I'm thinking things like traffic. How many cars go by on a road specific times a day? Would that not be unbiased data, or would that be a problem of the road we choose? Cybele, do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I had a different track that I was going down that I will go down, but I just want to answer that question first because I live on Woodbine or near Woodbine Avenue in Toronto, and we have a bike lane that is very contentious. And I gather when they were checking to see how many bikes went down, the bike group knew and sent all the bicycles down that day. And so this is a pretty steep hill. And it is not well trafficked by bicycles, and the cars essentially stall on it and possibly create more environmental problems from sitting in traffic than they would be from moving. So I'm not sure even traffic data is neutral, but it's not the one that I have the most concerns about by any stretch. But just to say that even these more innocuous ones are of potential concern. But I 100% agree with everything that Mai said. So effectively, I would also add that often when these AI folks are involved, one of the earlier steps they do is to, quote, clean the data, to make sure that all of the data agrees with each other. And they call it cleaning the data, but often I think of it as sanitizing the data, because if the data is problematic, they can make it look better than it actually is. And don't necessarily speak to the end users or the people whose data was collected to know where the problems lay in the data itself. One of the more difficult or challenging examples to think of is in a hospital environment, for example, at a provincial scale. There's a concept of straight lining where nurses can go in very, very busy and put check marks down the whole list of things that may be going on in the room. And how would one know if that actually was happening or not? Did the person actually, were they able to toilet properly or not? That information may not be reliable. And if it's not reliable, then how can decisions be made, for example, about alternative level of care and what happens to seniors and when should they go to long-term care? And the impacts, the ripple impacts can be quite significant in terms of bed assignment and really life and death choices for many people. And so I 100% agree also with Mai's, one of her last points, which is around the transparency. And maybe for the data that we already have, one of the solutions, and again, it's not the only one, I'm sure we'll talk about many today, but one of them is going to be around the transparency of the lens. You know, who did collect this data under what assumptions and in what context? And the more context richness that we have about how the data was collected, the more that we know what was left out. I think we can just start with the assumption that the data is biased and that the data is problematic, and that you can't erase that bias. You can only sanitize it, which is not the answer we're looking for. It would be much better to improve the data going forward, and also to have much more transparency about what we have right now.
I think that's really, really interesting comment. And Megan, I'm interested in regard especially to the project that you were working on through this past year. Would you say one of your motivators to do that was this idea of inclusion of data? I mean, I'm not totally sure. Maybe you could tell us a bit about the background and then comment.
Yeah, so I think building off of what Cybele was saying about who is collecting the data and where the data starts is really important. And so lots of my research is focused around these like massive data gaps and how we create those. So I think like building off of the hospital example is really good because it helps us see a little bit more who is included within data and what data we think of as neutral. So like healthcare data is data that's really protected and largely not accessible on the basis of things like privacy. And so what we see when that happens is there's a decision that gets made about who is going to be included, what level of inclusion is possible in maintaining privacy. But then there's also, of course, like going a step back when we look at the decisions that get made about who is included in data. So if we look at like the census, for example, we always start by excluding entire groups of people. So the census is built upon the exclusion of incarcerated people, people in long-term care institutions, people in hospitals, and people in other private dwellings. And so I think that it's important to see both the supposed neutrality of this thing that is supposed to be collecting data on everyone, but then also the way in which data is collected from there. So until 1991, there was an institutional survey of people who were living in hospital type settings about what their experience of institutionalization and their experience of living in Canada, just like everyone else on the census is, was. And so they asked the people living in those settings the questions because they know what's happening to them. They're able to answer questions largely once you put the effort into conducting an accessible census. And now the way in which the data is collected for those populations is that, so before there was 300 questions asked to people, and now there's 3 questions asked about people, answered not by them, but rather by the institution, so by the managers. And so then we get things like what Cybele was saying, where they're just checking a list and checking off characteristics that like might not be the case because they don't know the complex realities of the people living within their settings. And it also like doesn't look great on the part of the institution if they're doing that. So I think it's a faulty premise to assume that data is neutral from the beginning when we make so many decisions to even get to the stage of collection. And then once we get to those stages, of course, like they're so politically guided and so politically overseen. So the survey that I was talking about just now, the institutional survey, it used to be run by the Canadian Institute of Health Information and Health Canada because they were the people who were funding it. And then of course, once it switched over to Employment and Social Development Canada, who was running the disability survey, it switched to not include people in the institutional settings. And so we can see how those surveys and those data sources and those pieces, even if they're, regardless of if they're open or closed, are still being used in an incredibly biased way to be able to generate the data to begin with. Yeah, that's maybe where I'll leave that piece.
I think it's really interesting to me because I know that, and again, those watching us who were educating around open data to audiences, including inside government, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we used to talk about interpretation of data possibly being biased. But if the data was open, in other words, other people could examine the same data, it was a good thing. We advocated that as a good thing. But really what I'm hearing, and this is something that I have to be quite clear about, we never really talked about, nor did we get that question a lot from the people we were talking to. The hand going up and say, excuse me, but could the data possibly be biased? It really didn't come up that often. So what I'm really hearing is maybe we need to enshrine this into our work, and that would include the values that government is bringing to their open data initiatives, mission statements, things like that, to first of all, maybe acknowledge that there's potential bias, and your intention is to do your best to remove that bias. And that kind of segues into the idea of inclusion, right? The more people you include, even in the planning, whether it be surveys, questionnaires, or even as Cybele is indicating, where you're setting up the road and perhaps announcing that you're going to do the survey over this time period is a little suspect, right? Because if in fact then people can kind of cheat the data, that's not a good thing, right? So I'd be curious when we open things up to our audience for questions. And in fact, you could start submitting questions as we talk here. There'll be a moment when we're going to actually bring you into the conversation, whether or not you're finding that you've been doing the same kind of things. Someone's saying here, you were talking to the wrong people if you didn't hear about data bias. I heard about data bias, but again, it was how you're using the data, right? Not collecting the data. And I swear when we talked to divisions, they were clear that it was cool, it was well done, well thought out. And that's what I'm talking about right now, because obviously you can not release all that data. So I want to hit that out there to you guys in the audience, because if you're not doing it, I think we should be doing it. And if you are doing it, excellent, right? Yeah, Cybele, come ahead.
I really want to address how a number of organizations have tried to deal with this problem. And that is with this whole proxy identification. What is the bias, and then what is the proxy or representative of that bias? Like, if we're ignoring this group of people, this group of BIPOC people, is it based on their postal code? Can we then stop collecting postal code, stop including that, and then we fix the bias? And all, again, we end up doing is sanitizing the discrimination. And it's really important that we not try to erase bias. I think erasing bias erases the people that we've discriminated against and erases their experience of discrimination without actually improving their lives. I think what we have to do is acknowledge that this is biased, work with communities to identify where in this area they've experienced these negative social impacts, and start to identify with them, in partnership with them, and really co-constructing with them where these problems lie and how to address them, which is not so much of a data question, right, in some ways. But identifying those flags, there might be an opportunity, for example, in open data sets, to have a place where community could flag concerns about the data itself, so that when you look at it, you don't just get the note from Statistics Canada, for example, about the census saying that, you know, this is only people who self-identified as people with disabilities, and then this 15% stat gets tossed around when it's underrepresenting people with disabilities all over the place. But you actually get the community saying, hey, these are our problems with this data set. When you look at this, keep this in mind.
We do have a question that's come in. I think it's related really to what we're talking about right at the moment. And it's a question actually for Cybele and Megan. How can we make sure that data collected from people with disabilities is not given to a third-party place when we give personal data? So again, it's this idea of collecting it, but it goes somewhere else. Yeah, go ahead, Megan.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think, so I was going to give an example, and I think that this goes over it well, but if we look at like COVID data specifically, then we can see that in Alberta, it's a really good example, because in Alberta, they identify people using their comorbidities. So they like labeled that you're someone who has XYZ health problem. And so that can be good in some ways, because it allows for us to understand the impact of comorbidities on COVID-19 outcomes. But because they're not reporting the group home or the institutional stats, we don't actually know if people are dying or getting COVID because of their comorbidities, which isn't possible. You don't get exposed to COVID as a result of comorbidities. You get, you can become, you get COVID by like who you're interacting it with and where you're sharing airspace. And so by showing the disability type and not the place that they're catching COVID or being subject to COVID-19, such as being within long-term care settings or being within group homes or being within psychiatric institutions, then it's not really telling us the story about COVID-19. It's telling us that those people, those disabled people are dying, and it's okay that we like don't necessarily, they're dying because of their disability, as opposed to they're dying because of the conditions put upon them by our funding regimes, our institutional regimes, and so forth. So I think that's like an important way to understand the differences in and the bias that can be implicit in how we're reporting data. I think that there's not really a way for us to guarantee that the data that we're giving people isn't being used by a third party. So a really good example of this is the Interrai system. I don't know if folks here are familiar with that. So it's a regional health reporting system, spelled INTRERAI. And it's where the most of the COVID-19 analysis has come from. And what they do is to understand the impact on certain communities. So like if you have a developmental disability, they would go through and use an algorithm to determine who has a developmental disability and if they're being and if they have had COVID-19 and their experience with it. And so when we use an algorithm like that, using a giant database like Interrai, of course, it's not going to be neutral. It's also not going to correctly identify all the people with the specific type of disability that you're looking for. And again, it doesn't go over the conditions of disability that they were experiencing, such as institutionalization. And so, but it is like one of the ways in which our data is used by by third parties and by researchers in order to identify data themes and COVID themes. Yeah, so I think we can't guarantee it, and data is largely used right now as a means of commodification. So I think it's a tricky thing that we are navigating right now.
I think again, this is something I think we need to consider a little more. Back to even for those who are starting out open data initiatives, but for those that are well underway too. I think Cybele touched on this, the idea of transparently indicating how you went about it, when you collected, providing as much detail as possible, fits into the theme of openness as well, right? If you don't provide any of that information, again, I think assumptions are made. And probably, I'm not sure how many people would jump to the idea that it's not neutral and it's biased. I have a feeling most people, even though they may not trust government that much, there's still, I think, an ethos that kind of says, oh, this is what they do, this is what they collect, this is what they're making decisions with. And if really deep dives into that data shows problems with it, citizens should be aware of that, right? And government's response should be to improve their data collection. That's really, I think, part of the open data arena. That's what we're trying to achieve. So this kind of comment, I think, is really, really significant. And certainly if I were back where I used to be, I'd be going, dull, because we just, as I say, and I was part of the early days, and so perhaps it's a little more mature now. But anyway, yeah, I really still, my radar is kind of going bing, bing, bing on this thing. So I think it's certainly relevant to the conversation about how you can improve your initiative. And as I say, maybe actually enshrine it in some text so that you're living it and you're not ignoring it. And I know the challenge really is, again, facing other divisions who are providing data to an open data group. How are you going to educate them to that? And how are they going to respond to this idea? Perhaps your methodology needs an enlargement here. What's their reaction going to be, and how are you going to counter that? Maya, you want to say something?
Yeah, and another example, and I think it goes beyond addressing and improving our data systems. I think, in some instances, it really is about the system itself that's biased and structurally unequal in ways that no matter how much you improve your data system, it's going to reflect those realities. So I'll be a little bit less vague and give a concrete example: the criminal justice system, right? And here we're talking about not data exclusion, but over inclusion in the data in ways that reflects the way that our criminal justice system operates. The way our laws, the activities and behaviors that our laws criminalize, and therefore the people who get criminalized as a result, and the priorities that policing services place. All of these institutional dynamics that come together to generate a data set, no matter how good it is, good in the sense that we think about data quality, it's going to reflect those system realities. And so I think a place to start is, how do we fix our systems and organizations and use data to track how equitable it is, but then also, is it achieving the bigger social goals that we want to achieve? So, rethinking, what does community safety mean? What does community safety and justice look like for different communities? Not just property owning, wealthy, right? People, but all people in poverty, people who live with homelessness. What does justice look like to them? What does safety look like to them? And build a criminal justice system that supports that, and also supports people who come into contact with that system. How do we help them rehabilitate and enter back into society as healed and supported people, as opposed to generating a ongoing revolving door, and the incarceration that we see of certain populations, like Indigenous populations and Black populations. And that really reflects the inherent anti-Indigenous and anti-Black racism that's built into the way we do justice. And our data are going to show that. But if we look at that data and think, this data is neutral, and I think a lot of justice organizations that use criminal justice data to understand how can we improve policing, how can we have more fair trial, jury systems. They're taking police data at face value without thinking, how does police data reflect? It's not reflecting crime in community, but rather it's reflecting the way criminal justice is done and the way police activities are prioritized. So turning the lens around and really thinking through those things to get us to a better place, as opposed to replicating those biases using data as good as it could be, right? So rather than tinkering with the machine, how can we rebuild it?
Cybele, did you want to weigh in? It looked like you might be raising your hand. No?
Yeah, no, I agree with, yes, I agree with my, again, I see this as a kind of distortion. If you can imagine that this is a net, you don't want to be going through the holes, but you also don't want to be caught in the net. And that the shape that net takes doesn't actually represent the being that is caught inside of it. And I think what I was hearing from the piece that intersects with what the way I was perceiving it, perhaps, is what are our values and priorities, and whose values and whose priorities. And if we don't examine it at that level, if we don't shift whose values and whose priorities that we're collecting data about, then we fundamentally aren't collecting the right data. And from a sort of disability perspective, the disability movement has gone, I would say, beyond the social model of disability, but the social model of disability as a kind of premise is that it's not the person's disability that's the barrier, that is the problem. It's the barriers erected by the society that are making it more difficult for the person with a disability to get what they want done. And so we are creating these kinds of barriers in defining people and putting people into boxes that we're creating then barriers, and then we're assigning value and priority to that and funding it accordingly and further entrenching those problems.
Megan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I really liked how both of you put it in regards to creating both the net and needing to not necessarily poke more holes in it, but rather to get rid of this system that is capturing so many people. And I think a good example of this is looking at medical assistance in dying legislation. So this was passed very recently by the Senate. And when the Senate passed this massive piece of legislation, they were like, well, we're going to caveat it and make sure that we are collecting race-based data regarding who is applying for MAID, and like at the same time expanded access to it really expansively. And so when we do things like that use data to justify making decisions that are going to implicate a lot of people, I think it puts both open data and it like uses the language of progression in order to and using data as that piece of progression to allow for these broader systems that are going to keep causing harm to marginalized people. So even though we're like gathering race-based data around medical assistance in dying, we're not doing things like including if people are on the wait list, because we don't have a national waitlist survey or a national means of collecting waitlist data. So like in Ontario and Alberta, I think are some of the only two provinces that have a database regarding waitlists that's openly accessible, but provinces like Manitoba and BC don't have one at all. So when we have those things and we know that waitlists and being unable to access services is like a very integral part of mitigating loss of life due to either suicide or medical assistance in dying, we're just allowing for those systems to continue and not questioning what is creating the conditions that are making people request medical assistance in dying. And so when we do things like only open up a certain very small piece of the data, or only collect a very small piece of this much, much bigger puzzle, then we're allowing for these systems to really expand and move forward.
Excellent. And Cybele, join in.
I really want to build on what Megan was saying, because what I was hearing from Megan is the sort of granular aspect of how that made our medical assistance in dying problem manifest. But at a larger level, for folks who haven't been really that engaged in that conversation, there has been folks within the disability community who've been talking for a long time about the risk that that MAID was created on behalf of the privileged few, for whom getting access to this, who had the money to pay for the lawyers to push for MAID, and that the folks on the more disenfranchised end, often without the resources to support them to get the chronic pain support they need, or to get the care needs they have actually met, basically are left with this somewhat Sophie's choice of, live without the basic needs met, without being toileted, without being having basic pain management, or you have the choice of the doctor will help you kill yourself. And that this is now being, raised. For example, there was this excellent podcast on Canada Land about it now, as if it was unintentional. And yet this conversation came up well early in this debate, in particular with organizations like Not Dead Yet and the Disability Justice Network. And that the folks who are in intersectional categories, folks who are BIPOC, are potentially in much higher risk of being caught in that net, of being basically given that kind of impossible choice, where that they can't get the support they need to live, and are then therefore being considered expendable or too expensive to support, and being offered really suicide as the way out of abandonment and social neglect. And so it was really interesting, thank you, to hear Megan say, well, here's how they do it in data. Here's how they embed that problem in data. And, if you don't know what to look for, you might not even see how they're doing it. There's a bit of a sleight of hand.
I think, these are really deeply, I don't even want to use the word complex. I mean, they are complex, but the fact is, these are really important things that we start to address. And I think too often there's a stuck in a process, stuck in a culture, stuck in a methodology, right? And I have to say again, I don't hear this kind of discussion happening a lot in the open data community per se. And one of the things I wanted to get to was the fact that there's so many disenfranchised groups, right? Be it females, be it Muslims, be it Indigenous, be it transgender. I mean, we in fact have a checkoff list that we could go through, but where do we start, and how do we accomplish an end point? Maybe again I'm being naive in saying that we could reach a place where there is no discrimination, there is equal access, there is inclusion. It's got to start somewhere, obviously, but how do we, make sure we get there? A person on a staff may feel this way, but is blocked by management, whether it be policies or just a token effort, those kind of things. And I'm thinking recently what happened with the hockey player in the Chicago Blackhawks, right? Institutionally, they had a problem. And it was like 10 years in the making to resolve. And will it, in fact, ever happen again? Probably. So, is it individual commitment, or is it individuals insisting there is a more collective commitment? You know what I'm trying to get at? How do we go about so many different layers? And right now, maybe they're working in silos. So, if I'm concerned about equal pay, I'm lobbying for that. But what about all the other things? Like how can my efforts here improve efforts there? How do we come together, I guess, is what I'm asking. That's a big one, right? Too complex? I mean, where would you start?
I think the fact that we're having these conversations late as it is a start. But yeah, we need systems change. We need organizational change. I think individual efforts are great. I mean, it's got to start somewhere. And we are working, I don't want to, underappreciate all the efforts of advocates for equity and anti-discrimination that our work today and these conversations are building on. And it's decades and decades of advocacy from the ground up. So starting to listen to people, I think, we're hearing conversations about equity, inclusion, diversity all across, different organizations. Some more, shallow, some a bit deeper. Organizational commitments are all over the place, but at least people are having that conversation. I think that's hopeful for me to see. That's a tough one.
Yeah, because I think it takes commitment from everybody, right? And we have to share a similar value set. I mean, we were talking about ethics and other Go Open Data work. And, my ethics, your ethics, are they the same? Me ethics, Sue ethics? And, it's getting, a common agreement. And we even talk about democracies. I mean, I was looking at the definition of democracy recently, and a true democracy is majority rules. And that's dangerous too, because you're going to be excluding a lot of minority in that sense, right? Let's see, I see both Cybele and Megan's hands up. We usually end around now, so with everybody's permission, I'm going to continue. And I do have one question I want to get to as well. But let's carry on for a bit here and see if we can keep our audience. I'll do it. Okay, let's start with Megan, and then we'll come to you, Cybele.
Yeah, I think Bill, kind of reflecting on what we were talking about a little bit earlier, is that when we think of the complexity of everything and focusing on like really specific communities, I think it really misrepresents the complexity within communities and the diversity within communities. And so like when we're talking about disability, it's important that we talking about disability is also talking about Indigenous issues and issues of both like medical racism and broader systemic racism that results in an overrepresentation of certain communities with disabilities. Like if we look at, the terrible drinking water that's on First Nations, which can cause a lot of different disabilities. And so we know that our communities are complex. And so when we talk about focusing efforts towards a specific community, I don't think it's really helpful, because then it's not including all of the different diverse parts of the community that make us within this broader system strong. And so like working towards increasing data and increasing rights and improving quality of life for people, if we're just focused on improving quality of life for disabled people, then it's not going to challenge so many of the problems that make quality of life worse, such as the affordable housing crisis, the subminimum wage for people, and you know, all of these different factors that all play into each other and really compose the intersectional identities that are so important to our society. And yeah, maybe we'll go to Cybele. I'm gonna have to take off in about 5 minutes, but I'm really enjoying this conversation.
So am I. So yeah, leave when you have to leave, and thank you if I don't get a chance to say goodbye. And hopefully we'll talk some more and stay in touch for sure. So Cybele, let's go to you and see where you're at.
Well, the good news is that Megan said probably better than I would have many of the same things that I was going to say, but so I'll build on that rather than repeating it. Because yes, especially, I don't know, I think as maybe this is my bias, but I think especially in the disability community, there's a pigeonholing that goes on a lot of time, which is super problematic. Because folks with disabilities are extremely diverse within, and so that that intersectionality is super important. The many manifestations of disability and the differences in voices between different kinds of folks within that space is really wide and varied and often tokenized. So there are specific voices that get chosen who have more privilege, and that can be white privilege, and that can be compliance privilege, and various other ways of, you know, the system basically getting the people they want to say the things that they want them to say. And in the healthcare space, I've heard it referred to as sort of patient pandas. To sort of say what is wanted to be said. So I think of actually something that came up in the smart city conversation when Sidewalk Lab said that they wanted to include more people, and I thought about it as, you know, somebody with a big house in Rosedale having a Christmas party and saying, we want to be fully inclusive. You know, we'll have a ramp. We'll make sure you're picked up in a taxi. We'll, you know, have vegetarian meals. We will cut your food for you. But ultimately, you're still attending their Christmas party. And at the end of the day, they decide when it starts, when it ends, what you get access to, and the power is entirely in their hands. And I think what we're really getting at is a conversation about power. And I don't think that you can have this conversation about data equity without having the conversation about power and equity.
Yeah, and I think we were hoping to get into even what we'd call white privilege. And as a white male, I certainly feel concerned about what that means. And interesting enough, not so much for me, because I acknowledge that, you know, I've had advantages, but it's more, how can I contribute? What can I do? I don't want to be seen as, you know, preventing access and inclusion, et cetera. We're losing some audience, so I can see that people do have to run. So that's for another day. There were two comments that I do want to get to, just to see your opinions quickly before we wrap up. And the first one is from Jane, who did have to leave. She's talking about data literacy. How about data literacy? If folks have a context on data, is there a need for improved ways to interpret the impacts of these contexts? Will context, in other words, lead to better insight on the data that is collected? I guess I don't know if that's a yes or no, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really important topic to touch on in terms of, you know, access and equity to in access, but also capacity to benefit from open data, and communities capacities and resources that they, you know, they can access in order to really pull out the value from what open data could be, but also contribute to and be part of these conversations. You know, we know there's inequities all over the place, and that manifests in, you know, in the reality that, you know, communities that really could use and benefit from open data are not at the table. They're not necessarily they don't necessarily know where to, you know, to access the data. And, you know, even should they access the data, how to put that into practice to support advocacy on behalf of members of their communities. And so data literacy and equitable access to data literacy and education, I think that's an important space that the open data community could really support, and doing more to reach out to people.
I think it's interesting because we do have more comments, but I do think we're going to wrap up. But I think it sets a stage for more conversation on this very issue, perhaps at our conference or even a special event. And Cybele, we really have to cut off.
Like a one sentence line just to say that you asked if there's an endpoint, and I think there is no endpoint. This is a journey, and it's a journey for literacy. It's a journey to bring more people into the conversation. It's a journey to shift the conversation and recalibrate the conversation. So first steps are great, but we need to have an open door to this conversation.
Awesome. You're quite right. And I think something that sets the stage for that actually is we're not going to answer this question, but it's from Jonathan, one of our good team members. System complexity is a challenge as governments transition to digital services. Are there any use cases that are outliers in terms of simplifying the layers of siloed data? I think that would be a great starting point for a future discussion, either on the cafe or perhaps, as I say, a seminar at our next conference. This was really wonderful, folks. And obviously, we've got lots and lots to talk about. I'm not surprised. So I really do thank you all for your participation this morning. That includes Megan, who had to leave us. And the audience, there's only 3 of you left. I should have pointed out, we are taping this for Go Open Data's YouTube channel. So we'll put that in the mail with the address for people that if they had to leave, which they did, they can actually catch the ending here, which was, I think, as important comment as anything else. So that being said, we plan a webinar coming up in December, and that'll be it for 2021. So stay tuned for some information about that. And we'll just leave you with a quick credit roll. And thanks again for watching. Thanks again to our guests, Cybele and Mai. Really appreciate your work with us today. Thanks so much. Our beverages are free for open data coffee. Y'all come back now, you hear?